I want you to start off by stepping into a bit of a thought experiment with me today.
Oh, I love a good thought experiment. Lay it on me.
Okay, so imagine, just for a moment, that you are a conqueror.
All right, I'm with you.
And we're not talking about some, minor border skirmish here, or
Yeah.
like a quick raid across a river to steal a bunch of cattle.
Right, nothing small scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are talking about the kind of total, absolute conquest that gets your name carved into basalt monuments for literal eternity.
The kind of victory that rewrites the history books.
Yeah, that exact kind. You have led your army across these jagged mountains, you've met the enemy's great host out in the open field, and you have just completely, utterly broken them.
Complete tactical domination.
Right, you've ridden your warhorse through the shattered gates of their capital city, and you are standing there, physically watching the center of their civilization burn to the ground.
Wow, very dramatic.
Well, you killed their king. You marched into their treasury and just carted off all gold. And to make it all completely official, you've even married into the old royal line.
Securing the legitimacy, right?
Exactly. You've installed your own loyal governors from one end of this newly conquered land to the other. By every single metric your ancestors ever used to measure a victory, the thing is done.
The empire that stood in your way for centuries is just finished.
The map is yours. Period.
I mean, that is the absolute textbook definition of a total victory. The slate is entirely wiped clean.
Totally clean.
You own the territory, you own the population, the trade routes. As far as the geopolitical reality of your era is concerned, the civilization you just crushed is, well, it's a closed chapter in human history.
Exactly. It's binary, right?
Yeah.
You won, they lost.
Right.
Game over.
Right.
But then, the years go by, and something you did not plan for at all begins to happen.
Oh, here we go. The catch.
Yeah, the catch. Your victorious soldiers, the ones who did all the slaughtering and the conquering, they settle down.
Yep.
They marry local women.
Naturally.
Their children grow up. And you start to notice they are speaking the local tongue, not the language you brought from your homeland.
That's a huge shift.
It is.
Yeah.
And your administrators, the guys you put in charge to extract the wealth of this new province, they quickly discover a really frustrating reality.
Which is what?
The only people who actually know how to run this vast, complicated country, how to calculate the agrarian yields, how to maintain the irrigation networks, keep the roads open, they're the very officials you just conquered.
Ah, right. Because conquering a place and actually running it are two very different skill sets.
Exactly. So out of pure pragmatism, you keep them on the payroll. And then the assimilation just creeps into your own life.
How so?
Well, you start using their calendar because, it's just more accurate for the harvest. You adopt their court manners because they feel a bit more regal.
You start acting like the kings you replaced.
Right. You start using their specific words to describe what a proper king is even supposed to act like. You commission poems, and the poets you hire sing the deeds of the old kings, the very kings you overthrew.
As if those defeated kings were the true and rightful ancestors of your own throne.
Yes. It's wild.
And that right there is the trap springing shut. Because one day, maybe 2 or 3 generations after your great monument-carving victory, someone looks around and realizes the truth.
The conqueror has vanished.
Exactly. Your original language, your gods, the martial ways of your ancestors, they have all just faded into this hazy background. They've been completely absorbed.
But the country you conquered, it is still there. It's operating entirely on its own cultural logic.
It is still unmistakably Iran.
And that is exactly what we are plunging into today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a massive topic.
It really is. We are looking at a massive, intricate historical pattern that tracks over 2,500 years of Iranian history based on a fascinating stack of historical notes and analysis we've got in front of us.
2.5 millennia is a lot of ground to cover.
It is, but our mission today is really specific. We want to uncover the underlying mechanics of how a nation that has been repeatedly conquered, crushed, its capitals burned, and its end declared over and over again, somehow manages to outlive every single empire that defeated it.
It's basically the story of a civilization that treats total catastrophic defeat as just a temporary administrative setback.
I love that phrasing, a temporary setback. It's a profound structural puzzle.
It really is. We are talking about a civilization that has been militarily beaten more often and more violently than almost any nation on Earth. Yet it has this incredible capacity to quietly, culturally digest its conquerors.
But before we get into the gears and levers of how this assimilation actually works, we definitely need to establish a crucial ground rule for our deep dive today.
Yes, this is really important. The historical timeline we are examining covers a vast sweep of time, obviously, but it also brings us right up to the exact present moment.
Right. Extremely recent, heavily charged geopolitical events happening up to today, July 16th, 2026.
Events that are dominating the news cycle right now. A rapidly shifting Middle East, devastating conflicts, regime crackdowns, massive geopolitical realignments.
So because of that proximity to the news, it is vital to make our analytical approach here completely clear.
Absolutely. Our goal here is absolutely not to take political sides. We are not here to endorse any current government, we are not rooting for any faction, and we are certainly not making policy prescriptions.
None of that.
We are going to impartially unpack the historical facts provided in our sources to help you, the listener, understand the deep structural patterns that inform the realities you're seeing on your screens today.
We're dealing with history strictly as a tool for structural understanding, not as a political weapon. Okay, with that established, let's unpack this. To understand how Iran survives its conquerors, we first really have to understand what Iran actually is.
Which is not as simple as pointing to a map.
Exactly. If you look closely at the foundational architecture of this civilization, it becomes clear very quickly that Iran is not, at its deepest level, a set of borders.
Right. It's not a specific government. It's not even a particular religion, because all of those things have been totally obliterated and replaced multiple times throughout history.
So if it's not borders and it's not a government, what is it? Iran is an idea.
It is an idea about a place and an idea about the people who belong to that place.
To really grasp the weight of that idea, we have to look at the deep history of the stage itself, right?
Yeah, the physical land. The Iranian plateau is ancient ground. I mean, if you go back 5,000 years, you find a civilization called Elam in the southwest of modern-day Iran.
5,000 years. That's incredibly old.
Right. Elam was raising cities, developing complex writing systems on clay tablets, and basically acting as a direct geopolitical rival to ancient Sumer and Babylon.
While much of the rest of the world was still practically living in tree history.
Exactly. But the identity that we really associate with the word Iran takes shape a bit later.
Right, around the 6th century before the Common Era, roughly 550 BCE.
Yes, that's when we see Iranian-speaking peoples, the Medes and the Persians really dominating the plateau, and this is when you get Cyrus the Great.
Cyrus. We all know the bullet points there, right? Cyrus overthrows the Medes, swallows the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, takes Babylon, and basically stitches together the Achaemenid Empire.
Which was, at the time, the largest empire the planet had ever seen.
Just massive, stretching all the way from India to the Aegean Sea. But what is mechanically important here isn't just the sheer size of the empire.
No, it's the sophisticated operating system they built to manage a territory that massive.
Exactly. The Achaemenids didn't just conquer people, they synthesized. They developed an incredibly robust administrative machinery.
Things like the Royal Road, right?
Yeah, the Royal Road was this ancient highway system that allowed messages to travel across the empire in days rather than months. It was revolutionary.
And they introduced the Dark, right? A standardized gold coin.
Yes, which totally lubricated trade from the Mediterranean all the way to the Indus Valley. And they appointed satraps.
Satraps were the provincial governors, right?
Yeah, these governors wielded massive local power, but they were tied back to the center through these really complex systems of auditing and royal spies.
Ah, the famously named eyes and ears of the king.
Yes, the eyes and ears. But beyond just the logistics of running the place, there was a deeply ingrained ideological framework.
This is where we get to the core concept, isn't it?
It is. This is the concept of Iran-Shar, literally the realm of the Iranians. And it wasn't just a political claim of military superiority, it was a cosmological narrative.
Cosmological, like dealing with the nature of the universe.
Exactly. In the Zoroastrian worldview that influenced these kings, the universe is essentially a battleground between Asha, which represents truth, order, and righteousness, and Druj, which is the lie, chaos, and deceit.
Okay, so a very clear battle between good and evil, order and chaos.
Right. And in this worldview, the King of Kings wasn't just some guy with the biggest army. He was the literal divine instrument appointed by the supreme god, Ahura Mazda, to maintain Asha across the world.
So Iran-Shar was the civilized center. It was the fortress of order surrounded by a chaotic periphery.
That is the defining concept. The Achaemenids encoded a really specific self-image into the culture, the idea that this plateau is the rightful center of the civilized world, the keeper of order.
I like the analogy from the sources here. If we think about the physical land, the borders, and the cities as the hardware of a computer, this concept of Iran-Shar is the software.
It's the perfect analogy. And what we're going to see over and over for the next 2,500 years is that invaders are going to come in and just smash the hardware with hammers.
They're going to absolutely pulverize the physical machine.
But the software just keeps getting reinstalled on the broken machine. And the craziest part is, it's often reinstalled by the very people who broke the machine in the first place.
It's incredible. And the first person to really take a sledgehammer to that hardware was arguably the greatest battlefield tactician of antiquity.
Alexander the Great.
Exactly. In 334 BCE, a young Alexander crosses the Hellespont with his Macedonian army.
He's young, he's brilliant, and he achieves the absolute impossible. He beats the Persian king, Darius III, at Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela.
He relentlessly chases Darius across his own massive empire until Darius is eventually murdered by his own satraps.
And then in 330 BCE, Alexander finally arrives at Persepolis.
And Persepolis, we have to remember, wasn't just a capital city. It was the ceremonial heart of the entire Achaemenid world.
It was a sprawling, magnificent, columned palace city. It was built specifically to showcase the wealth and the cosmic order of the King of Kings.
Right. During the festival of Nowruz, the New Year delegations from all over the known world would bring tribute there. It was a massive display of power.
And Alexander just burns it to the ground.
Just levels it.
Yeah, you can actually still walk among the scorched ruins of Persepolis today. The archaeological evidence of the fire is completely unmistakable.
It was a catastrophic, symbolic decapitation of the Persian world. The dynasty founded by Cyrus the Great was dead.
You essentially have a young Greek sitting on the throne of an empire that used to rule half the known world.
If you were an observer, standing there in 330 BCE, watching the cedar roofs of Persepolis collapse into ash, you would conclude with absolute certainty that Persia was finished.
Finished. Done. But what's fascinating here is that this is where we see the first real stress test of that software we were talking about.
Yes, Alexander achieved total military victory, but he fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of statecraft in a territory that vast.
Because when he dies young in Babylon, his generals carve up his massive conquests.
Right. They do. And the Greek dynasty that inherits the Persian heartland is known as the Seleucids.
And the Seleucids run into an immediate, insurmountable mathematical problem.
The numbers just don't add up.
Exactly. You cannot run an empire of millions of people stretching across thousands of miles of arid mountains and deserts with a few thousand Greek soldiers.
You can't just drop a phalanx of Macedonian hoplites into a continent-spanning empire and tell them to, figure out the agrarian tax yields of Bactria.
It's an administrative impossibility. The Greeks needed the exact people they had just conquered.
They needed the Persian bureaucrats. They needed the scribes who knew how to manage those complex irrigation systems. They needed the minor nobility who actually knew who owned what piece of land.
And by relying on that Persian administrative machinery to extract wealth, the Seleucids inadvertently ensured the survival of the Persian system.
The Greeks built these beautiful Hellenistic cities and gymnasiums, sure, and Greek became the language of the absolute highest elite. But the day-to-day engine of the empire, that remained profoundly Persian.
And because that engine kept running, it was really only a matter of time before the political reality aligned with the administrative reality.
We see this happen with the rise of the Parthians.
Right, the Parthians. They were an Iranian people from the northeast who slowly pushed the Greeks out and rebuild this massive, decentralized Iranian empire.
And they are incredibly successful. I mean, they fight the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire to a standstill for centuries.
They handed Rome one of its most humiliating historical defeats at the Battle of Cara. Just absolutely annihilated the legions of Crassus.
But the real internal shift, the real return to form, happens after the Parthians, around 224 CE, when a new dynasty takes over from within.
The Sasanians.
Yes, the Sasanians. They are fascinating because they represent a deliberate, highly conscious reboot of the Iran-Shar software.
How so? Like, what did they do differently than the Parthians?
Well, the Parthians had still carried a bit of that Hellenistic veneer. They sometimes even called themselves Philonines, which means lovers of Greek culture, right on their coins.
Wow. Even after pushing the Greeks out.
Right. But the Sasanians actively rejected that. They looked back past the Parthians, past Alexander and the Greeks, all the way back to the deep antiquity of the Achaemenids.
They basically declared, We are the true inheritors of Cyrus, and we are restoring the cosmic order.
Exactly. They formalized Zoroastrianism as the rigid state religion. They built this highly centralized, aggressive empire that stood for 400 years as the great Eastern superpower.
Just locking horns with the Byzantine Empire across the Fertile Crescent for centuries.
So if we look at the mechanics of this first great historical test, what's the takeaway?
Well, the most legendary conqueror in human history, Alexander the Great, completely decapitated the Persian state, and Persia essentially just waited him out.
They absorbed the useful bits of Greek administration, spat out the rest, and came back entirely as themselves. Alexander proved that the physical empire could fall while the systemic idea survived.
But, and this is a big but, Alexander only swapped out the management at the very top. He didn't fundamentally try to change the daily lives, the religion, or the language of the average person living on the plateau.
Right, and that sets up our next major historical hinge point. What happens when a conqueror doesn't just want the throne and the tax revenue?
What happens when an invading force arrives with a new religion, a new language, and a new societal paradigm, and tries to replace your entire worldview at exactly the same time?
That brings us to the 7th century, and to a conquest that, by all historical logic, really should have been the true permanent end of Iran.
We are talking about the arrival of the Arab Muslim armies.
The geopolitical scene right before this happens is perfectly set for a collapse. The Sasanian Empire, this great Persian superpower, is completely exhausted.
Because they had just spent the better part of 3 decades fighting a grinding apocalyptic world war with the Byzantine Empire, right?
Exactly. Both empires had basically bled each other white. The treasuries were totally empty, the agrarian base was ruined, and the population was incredibly war-weary.
And right at that moment of maximum vulnerability, out of the Arabian Peninsula comes this totally unexpected electric force. Islam, carried by unified, highly motivated, and highly mobile Arab armies.
The contrast in military paradigms between the two sides is stark.
Like, how different were they?
Well, the Sasanian military was this massive, heavily armored, state-funded machine. They relied heavily on aristocratic, heavy cavalry with the cataphracts.
Big, slow, and expensive.
Exactly. The Arab armies, on the other hand, were smaller, far poorer, and lightly armed. But they possessed intense ideological cohesion and absolutely brilliant tactical mobility.
And in the 630s and 640s, at these monumental battles like Qadisiyah and Nahavan, these Arab armies maneuver brilliantly and just absolutely shatter the Sasanian military apparatus.
The collapse is incredibly rapid and deeply, deeply humiliating for the Persians.
The story of the last Persian emperor, Yazdegerd III, is just a tragic detail from the sources.
It really paints a picture.
His great armies are broken, his capital is lost, and he flees eastward across his own collapsing realm, just desperately seeking refuge. He eventually ends up in the city of Merv, and he is murdered.
But he isn't killed in some grand final stand against the Arab generals.
No, he is murdered by a local miller, alone and abandoned, simply because the miller wanted to steal his clothes and his jewelry.
It's stunning. A 400-year empire, the great rival to Rome, ends with an emperor dying in a mill for a set of clothes. The state is entirely gone.
And unlike Alexander's conquest, the Arab conquest penetrates down to the absolute bedrock of society.
Yes, over the following centuries, the population of the Iranian plateau gradually converts to Islam. Zoroastrianism, which was the ancient state-sponsored faith of Cyrus and the great Sasanian kings, is slowly marginalized.
The sacred fire temples, which had literally burned continuously for centuries, begin to go cold.
The entire cosmological framework of Iranshar, the king of kings, holding back chaos with the blessing of Ahura Mazda, is completely replaced by the Islamic worldview, centered on the revelation of the Quran and the authority of the Caliphate.
If there was ever a single historical moment where the distinct idea of Iran should have dissolved into a broader imperial identity forever, this was definitely it.
And we know this because we have perfect historical control groups right next door.
You mean like Egypt and Syria?
Exactly. Look at the rest of the Middle East and North Africa. Look at Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. They were conquered by the exact same Arab Muslim armies during the exact same period, driven by the exact same religious fervor.
And they did dissolve into the vast new Arab Muslim world. I mean, Egypt had been distinctly Egyptian for thousands of years. They had pharaohs, pyramids, a deep, impenetrable identity.
But within a few centuries of the Arab conquest, Egypt became permanently Arabic-speaking. Syria became Arabic-speaking. The Arabic language and Arab cultural norms just rolled over the entire coast of North Africa and permanently rewrote their linguistic and cultural DNA.
which forces us to confront this incredible historical anomaly. Iran became Muslim, yes, but it defiantly, stubbornly did not become Arab.
The Persians kept their language.
Wait, we really need to drill down into the mechanics of this because it honestly feels impossible.
It is a massive historical puzzle.
They lose their empire, their ancient faith is dismantled, they're absorbed into a massive caliphate ruled by Arabs from Damascus and later Baghdad. Arabic is the language of the new religion, it is the language of the court, it's the language of science and literature.
So how does a language just survive going underground for 2 centuries? Why didn't Persian wash away like Egyptian did?
Exactly. How does that happen?
It all comes down to the survival of specific social structures, particularly a class of minor rural nobility known as the Daquans.
The Daquans.
Yes. When the Arab armies conquered this massive mountainous territory, they faced the exact same administrative bottleneck the Greeks did centuries earlier. They needed local intermediaries to collect the taxes and manage the agricultural output.
And the Daquans were those local landed gentry.
Right. They owned the estates, they controlled the villages, and most importantly, they knew the complex local customs. The Arab conquerors essentially outsourced local administration directly to them.
Ah, so the conquerors inadvertently handed the keys to the countryside to the very people most invested in preserving the ancient culture.
Precisely. The Daquans learned Arabic to communicate with their new overlords, and many of them converted to Islam to maintain their social standing. But at home, on their estates, they spoke Persian.
They preserved the ancient Iranian myths, the genealogies, and the stories of the old kings.
So Persian went underground as a language of state, but it absolutely thrived in the homes, in the fields, and in the oral traditions of the agrarian class.
And eventually that underground stream burst back to the surface. By the 9th and 10th centuries, as the central power of the Abbasid Caliphate begins to fragment, local Iranian dynasties start popping up in the east.
And with them comes a massive cultural counteroffensive. We see the rise of a movement called the Shubiya.
What was the Shubiya movement exactly?
It was an intellectual and literary movement of non-Arabs, primarily Persians, actively pushing back against the Arab aristocracy's assumptions of cultural superiority. They were insisting, loudly and in writing, on the dignity, the depth, and the greatness of their own ancient heritage.
Okay, so the Shubiya movement set the stage. But according to our deep dive sources, the ultimate preservation of the Iranian identity came down to one man and one monumental work of literature.
Yes. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, a poet named Ferdowsi, who himself came from that Daquan class we just discussed, undertakes what is arguably the most successful act of cultural preservation in human history.
He spends roughly 30 years of his life writing an enormous epic poem called the Shahnameh, or the Book of Kings.
The scale of the Shahnameh is difficult to overstate. We are talking about 50,000 rhyming couplets.
50,000, that's insane.
It is twice the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, and it tells the entire sweep of Persian myth, legend, and history. It begins with the literal creation of the world, moves through the ages of mythical heroes fighting demons, and ends with the historical Arab conquest.
But the true genius of Ferdowsi wasn't just the stories he told, right? It was the specific linguistic tools he used to tell them.
Ferdowsi made a very deliberate, highly political choice regarding vocabulary. At the time he was writing, the Persian language was heavily infused with Arabic loanwords.
So it would have been really natural for him to just write in that hybridized language.
Exactly. But he didn't. He undertook this incredible linguistic excavation. He actively purged his poetry of Arabic words whenever possible, reaching backward into older, purer forms of Persian. He was basically building an ark to carry the Persian language through the flood.
There is a famous line traditionally attributed to Ferdowsi where he reflects on his life's work. He says essentially, "I have suffered much in these 30 years, but I have revived the Iranians with this Persian."
He claimed that he had built a monument out of words that wind and rain could not wear away.
And he was entirely right. I mean, for 1,000 years after he wrote it, the Shahnameh functioned as the spine of Iranian identity.
Even illiterate peasants, people who could not read a single line of text, they knew these stories. They would gather in coffee houses or around fires, and specialized storytellers would recite the epic battles of the hero Rostam or the tyranny of the Supant king Zahak.
It functioned as a national memory palace. The pre-Islamic worldview, the concept of Iran-Shar, was just smuggled right into the Islamic era, hidden inside 50,000 lines of highly memorable, rhythmic verse.
The cultural software was fundamentally backed up and distributed across the entire population.
And because this cultural foundation was so incredibly strong, here's where it gets really interesting. Something entirely counterintuitive happened. Persian culture didn't just survive under Arab rule, it aggressively expanded. It basically culturally colonized its colonizers.
This is one of the most fascinating geopolitical flips in history. Let's look at the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad.
Okay, Baghdad is geographically very close to the old Persian capital of Ctesiphon.
Right. And the Abbasids are Arabs. They are the leaders of the Islamic world. But who is actually running the day-to-day operations of this massive empire?
Persian bureaucrats.
Yes. Persian viziers, like the famous Barmakid family, who basically ran the caliphate for decades. The Abbasid court adopts Persian dress, Persian administrative titles, and Persian court etiquette.
The caliphs began acting less like Arab tribal leaders and a lot more like Sasanian kings of kings.
And Persian became the lingua franca of high culture, poetry, diplomacy, and statecraft across a massive swath of the world. For centuries, from the Ottoman courts in Anatolia all the way to the Mughal courts in India, if you wanted to be considered educated, civilized, and fit to rule, you had to speak and write in Persian.
So the military conquerors won the physical space, but the cultural operating system of the conquered ended up running the entire region.
Exactly, which sets us up for a terrifying hypothetical.
Right, because the Arabs brought their own high culture, their own complex theology, and a sophisticated administrative need that the Persians could infiltrate and eventually dominate.
But what happens when an invading force doesn't care about high culture?
What happens when an army arrives that has absolutely no interest in poetry, no interest in courtly manners, no need for complex agrarian tax systems, and is entirely focused on pure physical destruction?
That is the ultimate stress test. If the Arab conquest tested the cultural software, the wave that came out of the Central Asian steppe in the 13th century tested the absolute physical limits of the hardware.
We are talking about the Mongols.
Yes. Now, Turkic nomadic peoples had already been moving into the Iranian plateau for centuries before this, groups like the Seljuks and the Ghaznavids.
But they had followed the established pattern, right? They arrived, they conquered, they immediately realized Persian culture was extremely prestigious, and they adopted Persian as their court language and ruled as Iranian-style kings.
Right, they assimilated. But the Mongols under Genghis Khan and later his grandson Hulagu in the 1250s were an entirely different paradigm. Historical accounts frequently reach for words like catastrophe or apocalypse, and honestly, those words might be understatements.
The Mongol invasions were not about political subjugation. In many cases, they were about systematic annihilation. Great ancient cities in eastern Iran, cities like Nishapur and Merv, which had been massive, cosmopolitan centers of learning, trade, and civilization for centuries, were literally erased.
When a city resisted, the Mongol armies didn't just breach the walls and kill the garrison. They systematically slaughtered the civilian populations in numbers that are genuinely difficult for modern demographers to reconcile.
The mechanics of the destruction were horrifyingly thorough. And it wasn't just the loss of human life. The Mongols systematically targeted the infrastructure that made life on the arid Iranian plateau possible.
They destroyed the Qanats.
Explain the Qanats, because this is crucial.
These were incredibly complex underground irrigation channels that had taken thousands of years of continuous generational labor to build and maintain. They tap into underground aquifers in the mountains and use gravity to pull water down into the arid plains.
So if you destroy the Qanats in a desert environment, you aren't just killing the people currently living there, you are ensuring that the land cannot support human life for generations.
It is literal environmental warfare.
And in 1258, Genghis's grandson Hulagu marches on Baghdad. He sacks the city, rolls the Abbasid Caliph in a carpet, and has him trampled to death by horses.
The symbolic heart of the Islamic world is extinguished. The physical and political hardware of the region was pulverized into literal dust.
If you look at the Iranian plateau in the mid-13th century, it is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The cities are depopulated, the agricultural base is ruined, and the ruling class is a nomadic elite that views sedentary civilization with outright contempt.
And yet, if you fast forward just 2 or 3 generations, we see the most bizarre, stubborn historical recurrence play out all over again.
It's almost unbelievable. The Mongol rulers who settled in Iran, forming a state known as the Ilkhanate, suddenly crash into the exact same administrative cliff that Alexander and the Arabs hit.
Because eventually, the Mongols realized that you cannot extract sustained wealth from a desert of corpses. You cannot tax a ruined irrigation system from horseback.
If you want to be a wealthy, powerful ruler, You need the cities rebuilt. You need the qanats flowing again. You need trade routes secured. And who are the only people on Earth who know how to engineer those qanats and manage those tax registers?
The surviving Persian bureaucrats.
So the descendants of Genghis Khan hire the Persians. They elevate Persian viziers to the highest levels of government.
A perfect example is Rashid al-Din. He was a brilliant Persian statesman and physician who served the Ilkhanate. He didn't just manage their finances, he actually wrote a massive, comprehensive history of the world, one of the first true world histories under Mongol patronage.
And he wrote it, of course, in Persian. By 1295, the Mongol ruler of Iran, Ghazan Khan, officially converted to Islam.
It's an incredible transformation. Within a few decades of drowning Iran in blood, the descendants of these terrifying pagan horsemen are actively patronizing Persian art.
They are building magnificent Persian-style architecture. They're ruling in the traditional Persian style, and they are burying themselves in Persian tombs.
And just to prove this assimilation mechanism wasn't a fluke, history hits repeat roughly a century later.
Yes. In the late 14th century, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, sweeps out of Central Asia. He unleashes a fresh wave of unimaginable horror, famously building literal towers out of the skulls of the populations he slaughtered.
Yet his immediate descendants, the Timurids, undergo the exact same cultural capture. They settle in cities like Herat and end up presiding over one of the greatest cultural renaissances in Iranian history.
The Timurid era becomes a golden age of Persian miniature painting, architecture, and poetry.
Think about how strange this is. I mean, really think about the mechanics of what is happening here. A civilization suffers the absolute worst physical destruction imaginable. Their cities are leveled, their people are slaughtered.
And yet, the sheer gravitational pull of their culture, the immense administrative and aesthetic sophistication of the Iranian software, reaches up out of the rubble and pulls the conqueror's grandchildren into its orbit.
The conquerors keep dissolving into the very thing they conquered. The invaders always needed the deep know-how to run a real state, and adopting Persian culture was the only way to look like a legitimate monarch rather than a warlord camping in ruins.
To rule Iran, you had to become a little bit Iranian, and the moment you did that, the clock started ticking on your distinct identity.
Up to this point in our deep dive, the survival mechanisms of Iran have primarily been linguistic, cultural, and administrative. The Shahnameh, the Persian language, the bureaucratic tradition.
Right around the year 1500, the geopolitical landscape shifts dramatically. Iran undergoes a fundamental internal transformation.
It essentially downloads a major security patch. It acquires a second, much harder shell of ideological armor that permanently altered its borders and its relationship with the rest of the world.
This shift is initiated by an incredibly unlikely figure. Enter Ismail, a 14-year-old boy.
14! That's just wild to think about.
In the year 1501, this teenager is the charismatic leader of the Safaviya, which is a militant, mystical religious order. He commands a fiercely devoted fighting force known as the Qizilbash, named for the distinctive red headgear.
Despite his youth, Ismail is a brilliant and ruthless commander. He sweeps out of the northwest, conquers his way to the throne in Tabriz, reunites the fractured Iranian plateau, and declares himself Shah, founding the Safavid dynasty.
But it's his very first major policy decision that changes the trajectory of the Middle East forever.
Ismail makes a radical, uncompromising choice. He declares Twelver Shia Islam to be the official mandatory state religion of his new empire.
Now, it is crucial to understand the context here. At this time, the population of the Iranian plateau was overwhelmingly Sunni. Shia Islam was a minority sect.
Ismail sets about converting this massive Sunni population to Shi'ism. He does this through immense state patronage of Shia shrines, by importing prominent Shia clerics from places like Mount Lebanon and Bahrain to educate the populace, and, well, quite frequently, through brutal, uncompromising force.
This raises an important question, though. We have to look at the geopolitical mechanics of this conversion. Why force an entire country to change its religious sect? What does this massive shift actually accomplish for the Safavid state?
It creates a razor-sharp, heavily fortified ideological border. Let's look at the geopolitical chessboard of the 16th century. To Iran's west is the Ottoman Empire, which is an absolute juggernaut of military power. They are fiercely and proudly Sunni, and their sultan claims the title of Caliph.
Right. And to the east and north, you have powerful Sunni Uzbeks and the rising Sunni Mongol Empire in India.
So if Iran had remained just another Sunni Persian-speaking realm, it could easily have been absorbed politically or culturally into the Ottoman sphere of influence.
But forcibly making the population Shia Ismail drew a hard religious boundary around his realm.
It's an immunological barrier. Iran is no longer just the Persian-speaking lands within a broader, unified Islamic world. It is now a distinct, self-contained religious civilization, fundamentally alienated from and opposed to all its powerful neighbors.
And this religious shift wasn't just a matter of changing theological doctrines, right?
Mhm.
It created a totally new emotional and psychological universe for the Iranian population.
Exactly. Shiism carries a very specific historical narrative. It centers heavily on the concept of martyrdom, specifically the memory of Hussein, the Prophet Muhammad's grandson.
Who was killed at the Battle of Karbala in the 7th century by the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate.
Right. The story of Karbala is incredibly potent. It is the ultimate story of righteous resistance against overwhelming, unjust, corrupt power.
Hussein knows he's going to die. He is vastly outnumbered. But he stands his ground for the sake of truth and justice.
The Safavids weaponized this narrative. They institutionalized the mourning of Hussein through massive public rituals, passion plays, and the holy day of Ashura.
That narrative of the righteous, suffering underdog standing up to corrupt tyranny became emotionally hardwired into the Iranian psyche.
The Safavids fought long, grueling, bleeding wars with the Ottomans over the next 2 centuries, and militarily they often lost. The Ottomans had superior artillery and handed the Safavids devastating defeats, like at the Battle of Chaldiran early on.
But the ideological border held. The Ottomans could take territory, but they could never culturally or religiously digest the population, because the population now viewed the Sunni Ottomans not just as foreign invaders, but as religious oppressors in the lineage of those who killed Hussein. So what does this all mean for the idea of Iran?
Well, the country is now wearing two distinct overlapping layers of armor.
Layer 1 is the ancient software. We are the people of this land. We speak Persian. We are the inheritors of the Shahnameh. We are the civilized center of Iran Shar.
And layer 2 is the new Safavid security patch. We are the followers of the true path of Shiism. We are the righteous few surrounded by the powerful, corrupt many, and we do not submit to unjust authority.
When you fuse deep linguistic and mythic pride with an intensely emotional religious narrative of righteous resistance, you get a society that is virtually impossible to permanently subjugate.
And we see the resilience of this dual armor when the Safavid state itself eventually collapses. In 1722, an Afghan army invades, besieges, and brutally sacks the magnificent Safavid capital of Isfahan. The state is destroyed.
But the dual-layered identity of Iran survives the chaos. Out of the ensuing warlordism, a brilliant, brutal military commander named Nader Shah rises.
He violently ejects the Afghans, repels the Ottomans and Russians, reassembles the fragmented pieces of the empire, and marches his armies all the way to Delhi, sacking the Mughal capital and stealing the legendary Peacock throne.
The specific dynasties change. The Safavids give way to the Afsharids, then the Zands, then the Qajars, but the fundamental entity that keeps reassembling itself is always unmistakably Iran.
But as we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, the nature of conquest changes entirely.
We leave the era of warlords on horseback and enter the era of modern industrialized empires. The threats are no longer nomadic archers. They are European powers equipped with central banks, steam-powered gunboats, telegraph lines, oil companies, and covert intelligence agencies.
So how does this ancient dual-layered armor hold up against the mechanics of modern geopolitical warfare?
It results in what we can characterize as the modern siege. In the 1800s, Iran is ruled by the Qajar dynasty. Militarily and technologically, they are severely lagging behind the rapidly industrializing European powers.
And geographically, they have the profound misfortune of being caught in a geopolitical vice between two expanding juggernauts.
From the north, the Russian Empire is relentlessly pushing down through the Caucasus. From the south and east, the British Empire is pushing up from its colonial crown jewel in India.
This geopolitical chess match is famously known as the Great Game, and Iran was basically the board they were playing on.
The mechanics of this period are less about battlefield slaughter and a lot more about economic strangulation. The Russians and the British forced the Qajar kings into a series of humiliating treaties.
They carve away historic Iranian territories in the Caucasus and Central Asia. They force the Shahs to grant massive economic concessions, giving foreigners monopoly rights over Iranian tobacco, banking, telegraphs, and eventually oil.
William Knox Darcy, a Brit, secures a concession that basically gives away the rights to Iranian oil for an absolute pittance. And in 1907, Britain and Russia literally sign a treaty dividing Iran into spheres of influence right over the heads of the Iranian government.
Iran was bullied, bankrupted, and treated with utter contempt.
And yet, if we look at the broader map of the Middle East and South Asia during the 19th century, Iran achieved something remarkable. It is never formally colonized.
India is directly ruled by the British. Large parts of the Arab world fall under direct European colonial administration. But Iran, despite being severely battered and economically exploited, survives as a sovereign buffer state.
The deep-rooted cohesion of the society makes it too indigestible to formally occupy and administer.
And that survival, even in a severely diminished state, allowed for internal political evolution. The constant humiliation by foreign powers, combined with the autocratic incompetence of the Qajar kings, created a massive pressure cooker.
In 1906, that pressure explodes from within. The Iranian people, a coalition of merchants, intellectuals, and clerics, rise up. They demand a constitution and a parliament, known as the Majlis. They force the Shah to accept it.
This constitutional revolution is incredibly significant because it is one of the very first democratic constitutional movements in all of Asia. It proves that the Iranian software isn't just about ancient kings. It can adapt to modern political concepts.
But the foreign superpowers were not willing to let Iran evolve on its own terms. During World War II, Britain and the Soviet Union jointly invade and occupy Iran, entirely unprovoked, simply to secure supply lines and safeguard the oil fields.
They force the ruling monarch off the throne and replace him with his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Which brings us to the 1950s, a period that is absolutely foundational to understanding the modern dynamic.
Let's look closely at the mechanics of 1953. In the early 50s, Iran has a highly popular, democratically oriented nationalist prime minister named Mohammad Mossadegh.
Mossadegh looks at the oil arrangement where the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later becomes BP, is extracting massive wealth from Iranian soil while paying Iran a fraction of the profits, and he says, no more.
He legally nationalizes the Iranian oil industry.
This action obviously threatens the core economic interests of the British Empire. When economic boycotts fail to break Mossadegh, Britain approaches the United States.
In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence execute Operation Ajax.
Now, adhering strictly to the facts from our sources here, they orchestrate a covert coup d'etat, utilizing bribes, manufactured protests, and military coercion to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. They arrest him, crush the democratic movement, and restore the Shah to full, autocratic, pro-Western power.
In the short term, from the perspective of policy planners in London and Washington, the coup is a flawless victory. The oil flows back into Western hands, and a reliable anti-communist ally is firmly on the throne.
But structurally, historically, the psychological fallout of the 1953 coup is catastrophic.
It activates that deep, Safavid-era emotional armor. It plants an unshakable traumatic conviction in the Iranian collective consciousness that the great foreign powers will never, ever allow Iran to possess true sovereignty.
Furthermore, it permanently taints the Shah. It creates the widespread perception that any Iranian government that is too friendly with the West is fundamentally illegitimate, that they are foreign managers, not true Iranian leaders.
It perfectly fused anti-imperialism with the deep-seated cultural narrative of righteous resistance against unjust power. And that combustible mixture detonated in 1979.
The Islamic Revolution, spearheaded by Ayatollah Khomeini, was a massive cross-societal uprising that completely toppled the Shah's heavily armed Western-backed autocracy.
Khomeini brilliantly utilized the emotional language of Shi'ism, the narratives of Karbala, the fight against tyranny, and directed it not just against the Shah but against the superpowers, both the U.S. and the USSR.
The resulting Islamic Republic was explicitly built on the premise of fierce, uncompromising independence from foreign hegemony.
And almost immediately, history hands this new government a brutal, apocalyptic test. In 1980, Iran is in total domestic chaos. The revolution has fractured into competing factions, the economy is crashing, and the regular army has been severely purged of its experienced U.S.-trained officer corps.
To an outside observer, the country looks incredibly weak, divided, and ripe for the taking.
And right next door, the dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, looks at this chaotic landscape and makes the exact same miscalculation that Alexander the Great made, that the Arabs made, that the Mongols made.
He sees temporary political hardware failure and assumes the software is dead. He assumes he can launch a rapid, decisive strike, seize Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province, humiliate the revolution, and permanently hobble his neighbor.
In September 1980, Saddam invades.
Saddam expected the Iranian military to fold in weeks. What he got instead was an 8-year-long bloodbath.
The mechanics of the Iran-Iraq War are staggering in their brutality. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties. It evolved into World War I-style trench warfare, massive artillery barrages, and Saddam's extensive use of chemical weapons, mustard gas, and nerve agents against Iranian troops and civilians.
But look at the structural result. Saddam did not break Iran. In fact, he achieved the exact opposite of his strategic goal. By attacking a fractured, exhausted, post-revolutionary society from the outside, Saddam slammed the Iranian population together into a state of furious, existential, national unity.
The invasion gave the new Islamic Republic the ultimate crucible. The state rapidly mobilized the population by fusing the two ancient layers of armor together.
They appealed to the deep Persian patriotism of defending the sacred homeland, the Shahnameh layer, and they turbocharged it with the Shia language of martyrdom and sacrifice, the Karbala layer.
Young men volunteered for the front lines, not just as soldiers, but as martyrs defending Islam. After 8 years of unimaginable suffering, the war ended with essentially no change in the borders.
But internally, the external attack had welded the modern Iranian state tighter than it had ever been. It proved once again that applying extreme external pressure to Iran usually just hardens the diamond.
Which brings us to the exact historical moment we are living in right now. As we speak today, July 16th, 2026, this 2,500-year pattern of external pressure and internal resistance is being violently tested in real time.
And again, to you listening, we are looking at the timeline of the past 2 years with strict analytical neutrality. We are examining these geopolitical events solely to understand how they interact with the deep historical mechanics we have spent this hour discussing.
Looking at the timeline provided in our sources, the current crisis began to accelerate drastically in the summer of 2025. There was a brief, highly destructive war with Israel, which included targeted kinetic strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and military infrastructure.
Following those strikes, the Iranian economy, already strained by years of sanctions, went into a severe cascading freefall. Inflation skyrocketed, basic goods became scarce, and the currency collapsed.
This severe economic deterioration immediately triggered massive internal instability. Widespread decentralized protests broke out across the country, driven by deep economic grievance and anger at political repression.
The state, reacting to an existential threat to its authority, responded with a crackdown of horrifying brutality. The factual record indicates credible reports of many thousands of citizens killed, as the security apparatus attempted to crush the domestic unrest.
The timeline then moves to early 2026. Sensing extreme vulnerability within the Iranian state, the United States and Israel launched a far larger coordinated campaign explicitly aimed at collapsing the regime.
This campaign culminated in a decapitation strike that resulted in the killing of the country's supreme leader.
And that brings us to the present day, the summer of 2026, where a fragile ceasefire and a tentative diplomatic agreement are currently in place, though the situation remains highly volatile.
When we apply our structural analysis to this current tragic reality, the parallels are striking. The Iranian government has utilized extreme violence against its own citizens. History does not erase that reality. But the 2,500-year pattern we have traced remains stubbornly consistent.
Which is that overwhelming outside force is highly effective at inflicting physical and economic damage on Iran, but it is historically disastrous as a tool for remaking the society's internal political structure.
Over and over, from Alexander burning Persepolis to Saddam dropping chemical weapons, attempts to shatter Iran from the outside rarely result in a pliant, subdued nation. They typically trigger the immune response.
They produce a harder, angrier, more unified populace. External attacks often inadvertently hand a massive, unearned gift of nationalist legitimacy to whoever happens to be holding the reins of power in Tehran, allowing them to sideline domestic grievances in the name of fighting the foreign invader.
And this highlights a crucial concluding distinction. When genuine, lasting structural change does happen in Iran, whether we are talking about the constitutional revolution in 1906, the revolution in 1979, or the massive waves of grassroots protests driven by the youth in our current century, that change is almost entirely endogenous.
It is driven by Iranians themselves.
Yes. It bubbles up from within the complex cultural software. It is rarely, if ever, successfully engineered by foreign armies or intelligence agencies attempting to impose a new system from the outside.
So as we pull all these centuries together into a grand synthesis, what is the ultimate structural lesson here?
The lesson is emphatically not that Iran is some mystical, invincible fortress that can never be breached.
We have just detailed how it gets beaten constantly. Its capitals are burned to ash, its kings are murdered in mills, its infrastructure is systematically destroyed, and its people suffer horrific violence.
Militarily and economically, the Iranian state has been broken time and time again. The true lesson is much subtler and much more profound. It is that defeating the Iranian state and being permanently rid of the Iranian identity are two entirely separate concepts.
You can win the battles. You can occupy the physical plateau. You can extract the oil. But you cannot destroy a language with a cruise missile.
You cannot burn a 50,000 couplet epic poem that lives in the oral traditions of a population.
You cannot bomb a cosmological self-image of righteous resistance. The software of Iranshar, that deep, ancient sense of being a distinct, important people with a homeland and a destiny, has proven to be virtually impervious to kinetic weaponry.
The physical hardware can be smashed into pieces, but the cultural software endures, adapts, waits out the occupier, and eventually rewrites the conqueror in its own image.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, one that takes this ancient pattern and projects it into the uncharted territory of the future.
Let's hear it.
For 2.5 millennia, physical armies, nomadic conquerors, and modern superpowers with gunboats couldn't erase the idea of Iran. They couldn't break the software because they were using physical geopolitical tools against a fundamentally cultural phenomenon.
Right.
But what about the modern digital age? Will the borderless, overwhelming, ubiquitous force of global digital culture, social media algorithms, and instant internet connectivity succeed where Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan failed?
That is the ultimate stress test of the 21st century. Does a 2,500-year-old operating system adapt to the global network, or does it, for the first time in history, finally get overwritten by a culture that doesn't need to cross borders to conquer?
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the resilient ideas that outlive empires. Keep questioning the maps and keep looking for the deep patterns beneath the headlines.